We've just had a very brief discussion on, technically what is the difference between a closed fund and an open fund. What I would love, and the reason that I've invited you on today is, from an investor perspective, I think there's, lots of reasons why you might lean towards a closed versus an open fund. But I'd love to hear it from the fund manager's perspective of a closed versus open fund, because there are some people who will only run closed funds for various reasons, and others that will do like a hybrid or a mix of both. What's your view as a fund manager on the distinction?
It's a great question. It's great to see you, everyone. And there is no black and white answer. It depends. There are pros and cons to each fund. So let me try to take you through the process so you can understand pros and cons. So the basic definition of a closed-ended fund, obviously, is the fund that raises capital for a certain amount of time, typically 1 or 2 years. Then it invests the capital. It can invest the capital as it raises, as it goes along through a methodology called capital calls. After the fund is done raising capital, typically there's an investment period that allows the fund manager to keep investing. At the end of the investing period, the fund no longer makes new investments and basically runs these investments through a life cycle and then winds down. With an open-ended fund, it's a very different structure, as capital is raised on periodic basis, typically every quarter. Some funds operate on monthly basis, some funds operate on annual basis. So advantages of open-ended fund, people can go in and out on quarterly basis. It's called subscriptions and redemptions. Also, the distributions typically happen on quarterly basis. So one of the prime advantages of an open-ended fund from investor perspective is ability to request a redemption. Now, just to be very clear, most of the funds are long-term investment vehicles, and investment request doesn't mean you're going to be immediately granted. It's something that is very important for folks to understand. Closed-ended fund, you cannot even request a redemption. You don't have an option, because you are there for the life of the fund. With an open-ended fund, you can request it, and a fund manager will make every effort to redeem as soon as possible. So these are kind of the primary differences. Another really important difference from both investor and the fund manager perspective is that an open-ended fund, because it raises capital on quarterly basis, has to price its units fairly. So it means that at the end of each quarter, the fund has to determine what is known as NAV, net asset value, basically price per unit or per share. So what does it mean in real estate? It means that the fund manager has to value every asset in the portfolio and then adjust the portfolio up or down and adjust the price of units up and down depending on how things are going in the portfolio. It's actually harder from a fund manager perspective to run an open-ended fund. So open-ended funds are theoretically more attractive to investors because of that redemption mechanism, but the complexities to run them are greater. So open-ended funds just harder for a manager, a little bit more attractive to investors because they can request redemption. For again, closed-ended fund, you're there for the life of the fund. You have to be prepared to stick with all the investments going through their individual life cycle, and then as money comes back, the fund kind of winds down over a period of a few years as assets are sold. So neither structure is better than the other; they're just different. And Salina, you're right. In traditional real estate, most funds are closed-ended. So open-ended fund is relatively new concept.
Can I ask a question in terms of reporting? If you're an investor who, for whatever reason, makes the decision to go into a closed fund, what should an investor be expecting in terms of reporting from the fund manager, given that, theoretically that, it's a closed fund now, they're off with that capital just trying to manage and acquire assets. Is it reasonable to expect a certain cadence of communication?
Yeah, absolutely. So regardless of the structure, good communication is just a good practice. So portfolio reviews on quarterly basis is of paramount importance. So the fund manager needs to communicate to investors what the fund is invested in and how these investments are doing, good or bad. That's generally kind of the requirement, and that's a duty to the fund manager. And investors should look at how the portfolio is doing, not necessarily pay attention to the quarterly statements. So both funds, open-ended and closed-ended, generate quarterly statements. So depending on what the fund objectives are, quarterly statements by themselves can mean a lot or mean very, very little. So I'll give you some examples. So a Tempo Growth Fund, it's a growth fund. So growth fund by its objectives and by the assets in the fund is focused on value-add projects and generating forced appreciation. But in the short run, the fund passes through a lot of losses and what we call tax efficiency. So these statements, the fund statements, will show effectively reduction in the capital account value. So you could have invested $100,000, and a quarter later it looks like 90,000 or 85,000 or 97,000. The point is that is not really relevant because these paper losses, all they are is tax efficiency. It doesn't really mean the investments are doing great or they're doing bad. So for a growth fund, it is more important how the projects are doing versus what income it generates today. The same way you bought a building and you're going through renovation, right? What are you going to show in the first quarters while you're going through renovation? You're not collecting any rent. You're going to show losses. Is it an alarming thing? Absolutely not. As long as it's going through its plan, its life cycle, what it's supposed to do. Is it running on budget and scope? Are they renovation progressing the way they were supposed to? Too many, too few, complexities, violations, whatnot. On the income fund, things are a little different because on an income fund, an example would be Tempo Opportunity Fund. It's both an income and growth. You can actually look at statements, quarterly statements, and assess performance to some degree. So Tempo Opportunity Fund happens to be a mix of income and growth. Growth is typically delayed gratification. There's no better way to put it. Your gratification is when the projects sell. Until they sell, until they all that time in between is basically value-added work, or you are you're suffering, you're delaying your gratification until there is a sale event, or maybe refinancing and return of capital. So for a pure income fund, you want to look at quarterly performance because it's got very little upside, so quarterly numbers matter. For income and growth fund, quarterly numbers also matter to the degree that the fund invests in the income projects and getting a decent idea what the growth projects are doing. So again, statements themselves could be meaningful or less meaningful or completely meaningless. What is important is a portfolio review. So we did hold recently investor update calls for each fund. When you get a chance, I think you're invested, most of you, in both funds. If you don't have the link, just email me and I'll make sure I will get you the link to the recording. Listen, what we do, we basically go through the portfolio, go through the investments, how the portfolio is doing. That's more important than necessarily the numbers. And as example of Tempo Opportunity Fund, you can have a few slower quarters and then you have some exit events on growth projects, and the result you have massive quarters. So just understanding how each fund functions and whether you're getting all the income today or you're getting delayed gratification, some income today and some income in the future. These things do matter. And at the end of the day, in the long run, what you want to see these projects succeed and sell at a good price, and that's what gets you the return. So strategy matters as much as whether it's open-ended and closed-ended. But the manager, back to the original question, the manager must communicate well. And if they do, at least as investors, you have good transparency and good visibility on what's going on. Does that make sense?
That's a great response, Mike. I'd like to open up. If anyone has questions, please just go ahead and unmute.
Mike, Al here. Just from a an assessment point of view, should you be expecting a rate return differential if you're looking at one versus another one? Because in the closed fund, you're not going to get your money till down the other end. So there's a sort of longer term risk perspective, I guess, that you're taking. Whereas the other ones, you're getting a proportion of your return along the way. So you might find that the returns are less. What's your suggestion there?
Oh, great question. So I think you're familiar with quadrants methodology, and one of the key elements and one of the key observations in these quadrants, as you're delaying your income for growth, you're basically foregoing the cash flow today. Then why are you doing this unless there's a higher reward later? So the answer to the question is it's almost self-intuitive. Of course, you have to get higher rate of return on the growth projects than on the income projects because you're deferring your compensation or your returns. And if that's the case, hopefully you'll get a higher rate of return. The same, by the way, is true on the dimension kind of investment grade versus speculative. You may be getting the income today in quadrant 1, and if you're doing also quadrant 3, you need to be getting higher return because you're taking higher risk. So there's two dimensions. One is the risk dimension, and the other one is cash flow versus growth. So the answer to the question is absolutely. It's implied that target return in growth deals have to be higher than income deals, and target returns on the speculative projects have to be higher than the conservative ones.
Can I just add to that as well? That is such an important distinction you guys have made. And one thing that I know is really clear is we're lucky to be part of a tribe where we have a buffet of opportunities to select from, and therefore we can apply those distinctions. The average investor might have one fund that they know of, or basically they're just pulling a number out of a hat and hoping it goes well. So that distinction is less relevant. So it's relevant for us, but I would say for the average investor, they just wouldn't have a clue. It wouldn't be a meaningful distinction.
Yeah, thank you, Salina. And one thing I wanted to comment to the members and my conversation with you and just observing how you think, you're going way out of your way to make sure that the people you bring in, the buffet menu options, are genuinely highest quality offerings rather than pay to play, which is really important. There are plenty of organizations or plenty of what are known as promoters. So they don't charge members membership fees, but they make money by promoting some product. And then they create these bright and shiny objects, and their motivation is to sell because this is how they get compensated. On the reverse side, when you have a membership and you have a leader of the tribe like Salina, she is not motivated to sell you anything at all. There's no, I don't pay Salina for bringing the funds or the other way. We reciprocate. I serve your community by educating, and I appreciate your investments. So when we don't have pay to play mentality, you wind up selecting better options. And there are a lot of bright and shiny objects. The whole world is just full of promoters. It's to the point where we get deals across our desk delivered by promoters, not the operators. So we search to get to the actual operators and try to ignore the promoters for the reason that they create, first of all, middlemen, which is not necessarily always bad, but it is, shaves off part of the return. Number two, they have no real motivation other than sell. So there are, from time to time, if you think about it, just to give you an example. So Fairway America, and you've had, I don't know, did you have Matt speak or Darius? You had Lance speak.
Yep.
So in a way, you could say they're not a promoter, they're co-sponsor, which is a big difference. They actually participate in the projects, they invest in them, they have vested interest, and they co-GP these projects. That's a big difference between kind of sponsor, co-sponsor versus the promoter model. The promoter, a lot of promoters, and most of the promoted deals, unfortunately, are just not investable from my perspective. They're too rich for the sponsor and the promoter, and too skinny for the investors. And investors take outside level of risk for what is essentially mediocre return. So understanding upside when things go well, and the risk reward ratio is critical to generate essentially the best risk adjusted returns. Now, there is risk in everything, and we talked about this. Just the selection of the best projects is hard. This is the holy grail of investing, is picking the projects with the best risk adjusted return. So